Hello and good evening. My name is Anthony Orwick, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to this evening's Dole Institute of Politics Forum, and thank you for attending. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student of either campus and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would also like to hear from you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website's email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of tonight's presentation will be available on our website soon. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper will motion you to queue up at one of the microphones standing in the aisles. Please just ask one brief question. And now I'd like to introduce you to the Associate Director of the Dole Institute, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Anthony. I'll say welcome this evening to the Dole Institute of Politics, and especially welcome to our 2014 Innovation Series, Drones. And we're doing part 2 tonight, branching out, exploring new uses for drones. I would just call your attention to the back of your program. Please just glance at it. So if you're interested in our study groups, they're certainly available, and you can see the dates that are there. We also have an evening with Cindy McCain on March 25th. Again, we're very appreciative that you are here this evening, and we're very proud of this series. We had a great attendance last Thursday, and as I said, this is part 2. This series is being co-sponsored by members of the engineering department, and we were very appreciative of so many students to be here because I think this is an area that they were very interested as well, and certainly you are, or you wouldn't be here this evening. So KU School of Engineering, KU's Engineers Without Borders, KU Engineering Student Council, and KU Robotics. So I think this evening will be just as challenging as it was last week, but you will learn a lot, and you will always have that opportunity to ask questions, and I think that makes our programs even more enlightening because what you did not hear, you have the opportunity to hear those programs, but also we want you to feel a part of all of our series, and that's why the questions. So our guests this evening, I'll just start as an introduction with Kurt Barnhart. He's a professor and head of the Department of Aviation, Socializing in Aviation Safety and Human Factors Research at Kansas State University. He's taught numerous aviation courses, including general aviation operations. He's also serves as executive director of the Applied Aviation Research Center at K-State in Salina. I had the opportunity on a biennial tour with the legislature to hear from them in Salina, and it is we didn't know all of that existed within our own state. In 2009, Barnhart received the University Aviation Association Sorensen Award for significant scholarly contributions to college aviation. Our next speaker this evening would be Shawn Keshmiri. He's an assistant professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Kansas. He's conducted his postdoctoral research at the Center for Remote Sensing of Ice Sheets, also at KU. His research interests include online parameter and system nonlinear parameter and system identification. He has led the KU Aerospace Engineering flight test team. He's conducted over 100 successful autonomous flight tests and over 115 flight research missions in Antarctica, Greenland, and the USA. With over 30 publications, multiple presentations, and acquired grants and funding, he has been a prolific researcher. He also has done collaboration with NASA. Our third speaker this evening, Bill Donovan. is the president and CEO of Pulse Aerospace, a Kansas-based company focused on the development of advanced unmanned helicopter systems. He has expertise in aircraft conceptual, preliminary, detailed design, stability and control, structural dynamics, and UAS project management. He's conducted his graduate research at the University of Kansas Flight Test Laboratory. He holds 2 patents, and his previous work includes the development of several new unmanned aircraft systems, including the Hawkeye UAS, the Wolverine helicopter UAS, and the Meridian UAS. I think you can see the speakers are very diverse in what they're going to do this evening. And I will turn this program over to Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics. And again, I hope you will enjoy our 2014 Innovation Series, Branching Out, and we'll be exploring new uses for drones. Bill Lacey, and a round of applause for our guests.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thanks to all of you for coming out on an interesting weather evening, I guess. I understand I wasn't outside the Institute today, but I understand it got near 80, and it's probably going to be less than half that when we leave tonight. So I want to start out, gentlemen, asking each of you, and you can do this in any order you care to, but just a little bit of personal information. How did you get interested in drones? How did you come to UAVs?
So, do you want me to go first?
Go first, Shawn.
All right.
Don't be shy.
Absolutely. Actually, when I started my master's degree, I was working on hypersonic vehicles. And hypersonic vehicles, they're, as the name basically, just imply, they're about very, very fast aircraft. They're basically aircraft that fly at least 5 times more than the speed of sound. And that was my basically graduate research. And then I had the opportunity to go to a university and work as an assistant professor or stay here at KU and basically do postdoc. And almost everybody told me it is better to go and get a faculty position. But the university that they offered me the job, it was more or less research and more, I would say, teaching. So, and here there was this program perfect for development CRISIS, Center for Remote Sensing of Ice Sheet. So I basically thought about it, and finally I picked CRISIS. So I stayed as a postdoc here, and that was the basically point from Mach 5 to Mach 24. I changed it to Mach 0.3, Mach 0.1. So that is the way I basically exposed to UASs. Since CRISIS focus has been since 2004 to develop advanced UASs for Earth and science missions.
Okay.
For myself, I graduated Purdue University in 1991 and immediately went to work for Allison Engine Company, which is now Rolls-Royce. We produced engines for a variety of different platforms, and one of the projects that I worked on was the Global Hawk. It was a 3007 engine, and so I became exposed to UAVs at that point for the first time, really, and became very interested in the potential, and I saw this immediately as the future of aviation, and that's 23 years ago now. So we're still kind of just launching into the future. So it was an exciting project, exciting time, and as I began to develop my career and got into collegiate aviation, I followed the development of that platform and its implementation, and began to just become interested in it. And then I moved to Kansas in 2007, and we had a bad year for tornadoes in 2007. And some of you may remember Greensburg, Kansas was leveled in May of that year. And there began to be some discussion in the state as to how we could use these platforms to be able to mount a response, an economical response in an aerial search and rescue situation. And so the conversations just kind of grew from there, and so that's where we got our start.
Okay, Bill?
I started in school at KU, my senior year in aerospace engineering, I led the SAE heavy lift aircraft design competition, and we did well in that competition, and maybe got a little too much confidence, and we took that aircraft design into a graduate course. Dr. Keshmiri worked on that project, the Hawkeye, and that was fairly successful. Got a little more confidence, and from that started both graduate school and started a business. This was Viking Aerospace with a fellow grad student, Lance Holly, and a professor of ours. Did that for 5-6 years before Lance and I left to start Pulse a few years back. Along the way, I did my graduate work at the Center for Remote Sensing of Ice Sheets with Dr. Keshmiri, and I was able to work on the design of an aircraft called the Meridian. It was ended up being about a 26-foot wingspan, 1,000-pound unmanned aircraft, and we took that to Antarctica and to Greenland to measure ice thickness. And so I through school at KU, I was able to work on some interesting projects and spin that out into a couple of different businesses, and been doing it ever since.
Okay. I want all of you to talk about it, but Kurt, I want to start with you. Last week we really focused in our program on military use of UAVs and drones. Talk a little bit about all the different ways that people are exploring using UAVs and drones in in non-military situations.
It's exciting. I think I could probably summarize it in a statement from a colleague of ours who's now with University of North Carolina, or I should say NC State. Show me an application or show me an industry, show me a job that they're doing, and we'll show you an application for UAS. It's really almost limitless when you look at the potential applications out there. Agriculture right now far and away dwarfs any other potential market by almost a factor of 10. And so that's probably where we see the most potential. That's where most of our work has been, in the agricultural area. But we've also been doing some work in oil and gas, all the way from exploration to asset security, including offshore asset security. There's potential for power line, pipeline inspections, wind turbine inspections, wildlife patrols, even building inspection. We have someone talking to us this week that wants to use it for that. So we could talk all night just about the potential applications that there are. They're varied.
Well, I'm going to get Shawn and Bill to respond, but I want to just follow up real briefly. Give us a practical use that a drone might be used for in agriculture. I mean, what's something you've actually seen somebody do with it?
One of the things that we spend the most time doing is studying photoreflectance, and so we produce there's a measurement called NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And what we're looking at is photoreflectance, and it's how crops reflect sunlight. And healthy crops reflect sunlight differently than unhealthy crops. And so we can tell from one quick pass over a field, even before the crop shows any visible signs of stress, we can see where there's some breakdowns starting to occur. We can see drought stress. We can see pesticide overuse. We can see pest infestations. The potential this has to impact our global food supply is enormous. And that's what really we're focused on, is our Global Foods Initiative.
Yeah, okay. Shawn, Bill, talk a little bit about the non-military uses of UAVs and drones.
Absolutely. I think when you talk to people about UAVs, there are some very easy answers, like Earth and Science missions, or like Dole or dirty work. Look at the tsunami. We're in third year, exactly third year. 3 years ago, we were in the third year, basically, that this tsunami in Japan. They had this radioactive problem, and how they were going to inspect it. Are they going to send human over there? Oh no, they're going to send basically UASs. And I think I like to echo what my friend said. Since UASs are in different sizes, their payloads are different. When payloads are different, then applications are different. So it is not like they should be in specific size with the specific payload capability. Since this, I would say, flexibility is very, very unique, you can reach to any application you want. But the easy, basically one that we started and we were able to convince people that they should invest in it was Earth and Science. That Creases is basically around that. And it has been extremely successful. You can just look at the impact of what UAS has had in Creases and can discuss it later.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo the same. We look at agriculture, security, and mapping as our top three applications that we focus on in our business. And within those, it's somewhat surprising the specific applications that we look at that in agriculture, for example, aerial spraying of crops is an application that is very interesting. It's something that's been done in Japan. Yamaha has a vehicle that does this. And so the first thought is, so this can replace aerial applicators. And in some instances it can, and it could help in those cases. But really what it's useful for are the areas where we can't service today with aerial applicators. The same in mapping. A lot of the aerial mapping companies will go map large areas because it's efficient and effective to use manned aircraft to do so, but they don't want to look at mapping small areas, like a 40-acre field, if you're gonna, if you want to look at topography, you could quickly map that and quickly generate a topo map, but it's something that's not cost effective to do with manned aircraft. And so there's, in all of these examples, there are sort of new parts of markets that will open up for unmanned aircraft where they don't displace manned aircraft, but they supplement and add to what they currently do.
Okay. Shawn, I wanted you to speak more about your specific experience with Creases. I'm curious, how many of you know what Creases is? Okay, so quite a few of you, but can you just give a little bit of, it's just an amazing project that KU has operated for about 10 years, I think. Just give a little bit of background so everybody is working off the same info, and then talk about use of drones in the project.
Absolutely. So almost 10 years ago, 2005, a professor in Department of Electrical Engineering, Professor Gogogini, he came up with the concept that, all right, if we want to have fine resolution of ice sheets, the best way to do it is to use slow and I would say relatively slow vehicles to be able to fly in close proximity of ice sheets. And when you fly at very high altitude, the basically speed is very high, and this reduces the quality of modeling. And he talked to a friend of mine and my colleague, Dr. Rick Hale. They came up with this concept that, all right, let's use the manned aircraft that they have been using it for several years for remote sensing of ice sheets. But let's also just explore another application, which is unmanned aerial vehicle. So in 2005, NSF funded University of Kansas, I think almost about $19.6 million to explore these applications and technology development. So basically, the Creases was funded through NSF fund, and we started it. Actually, my friend Bill Donovan, he, as he mentioned, was the person who designed the Meridian, the largest unmanned aerial vehicle ever designed, built, manufactured, and flight tested by an academic institute in the world, not just in the state of Kansas or in basically US. And first flight test of Meridian US, as Bill mentioned, it is like 1,100 pounds, was done here in Kansas in Fort Riley. And it was in 2009, and then we continue this basically journey, I would say. And we have had 9 successful flight tests using Meridian, and very recently we, I would say, switched the gear. Complexity of large vehicles are very, very big relative to smaller UASs. And we came up with the idea that if we could miniaturize the radar system, we should be able to basically fly smaller UAVs and do the same. So the 85 pounds basically payload was shrink to 2.5 pounds almost. Basically we had very successful deployment 2013, 2014, and KU was the first to use UAS to sound the ice sheet in Antarctic. So we have been several, I would say past few years, using the fund that CRISIS has received. I forgot to tell you, CRISIS was basically refunded again for another $19 million in 2010 for another 5 years. So it will be around at least till 2015.
Okay. Kurt, you know, the aviation industry in Kansas is pretty extensive and pretty big. What kind of potential does Kansas have for a solid economic impact from the production of UAVs and drones?
Certainly, when it comes to the production, I think we're a ways away from a significant economic impact. I think it will come. AUVSI, this association in this area, Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, ranked Kansas as number 7 on the potential it's number 7 states out of 50 in terms of the economic impact that this industry could have on that state. When you factor in service, production, data collection, the operation, all of that together, it's a fairly significant number, but it's going to take a while. We're some distance away from being able to realize a lot of that.
Shawn, Bill, do you guys care to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a strong history in Kansas in aviation. Is one of the reasons we like to have our company here. There's also obviously agriculture. There's a strong background there, and so there's this intersection of the two, and the fact that agriculture is projected to be such a big portion of the future applications of unmanned systems makes Kansas a pretty nice place to be. So it'll be very interesting to see how this all folds out.
Okay.
I can also add a statistic. Basically, based on the latest statistic, it is estimated that UAS will add $82 billion in next since between 2015 2025 to U.S. economy and will create 100,000 new jobs. So it is going to be very, I would say, important part of U.S. aerospace industry for next decades.
Okay. One of the things we wanted to do with tonight's discussion is I wanted to have an entrepreneur on the panel, and so we were able to get Bill to join us. Bill, talk a little bit about what Pulse does and kind of what your goals are.
Sure. So we have focused our expertise, our niche is in small unmanned helicopters. And the applications that become interesting for helicopters are applications that require a decent sized payload, something, whatever it is, a sensor, or in agriculture maybe it's chemical spray, whatever it ends up being, but something with a decent weight that you need to get into the air efficiently and effectively and easily. And so we've spent 8 years now working on various helicopters and focusing on the flight control systems, because that to us is the key to not only reliable flight, stable flight, putting sensors where they need to be, but it turns out that's also the key to efficiency, that as we control the aircraft better, that leads to longer flight times, more efficient aircraft, et cetera. And so we have focused on the applications where people want higher quality sensors in the air for longer. So in agriculture, we look at the 3 stages of process where you can do crop stress detection. You could see that there is a problem. You could do crop stress diagnosis, where you could say this is what's causing this problem and here's a prescription of how to fix it. And then the last is treating the crop with whatever it is, whether it be chemical spraying, et cetera. And we focus on the latter 2 because you need different sensors to do the diagnosis than you do the detection. And then to do the spraying, you need to be able to lift a decent amount of weight to make it efficient and effective. The same in the mapping world. We look at carrying bigger cameras, higher resolution, better lenses, et cetera, and different sensors. Synthetic aperture radar, KU is a very strong player in that, and so we keep that partnership going, and we're very impressed with the work that they've done in Antarctica this past year. Multispectral sensors, hyperspectral sensors, different, more advanced sensors to get better data so that the end result is the data, is the something you can create some actionable item from. And so for a farmer, it in a lot of ways is this prescription map of we fly over your farm, and now we can tell you exactly where you need to water more or less, where you may need to spray a chemical more or less, et cetera, et cetera.
Bill touched on one of the high growth potential areas in this industry is it's what to do with the data. Most people don't really care about the platform itself, they just want the data. We can collect the data, we can collect far more data than we could ever use in terms of the resolution. When we look at a field is 3 to 5 centimeters, and that's at 500 feet. So the volume of data is almost overwhelming, but it's being able to use that effectively for the grower to be able to make decisions on what to apply more efficiently in this part of the field, where to irrigate more, things like that. So that is so key, that element he just touched on.
I'd like to get each of you your thoughts on this. Talk about the restrictions, the legal restrictions on drones, and kind of where you expect that to go in the near future.
Well, I'll start. That's one of the areas, since we focus on operations for UAS in our degree program. They have been historically fairly restricted in this country, and as we talked about before dinner, the biggest reason for that is because the United States has the most complex civil airspace system in the world. We have a huge network of privately owned aircraft, and they can operate in many cases without ever having to talk to anyone, flying point A to point B, and that's just one of the freedoms that we have in this country. But as such, it makes it a little more challenging when it comes to operating these systems, because the onus is on us to be able to see and avoid that other traffic. And so we have to be on the ground, on the lookout. And so the FAA has been naturally a little bit slow in integrating these into the airspace system. We are seeing that loosen up. We as a university, public institutions can apply for certificates of authorization. There's the experimental airworthiness certificate route. But up to this point, commercial operations have been very restricted. Now, we're waiting on a rule. The FAA is going through the rulemaking process, and we expect at least a notice or a proposed rule to be out later this year, November, December timeframe. That will give some guidelines in terms of who can operate these platforms and where they can operate them, the qualifications they have to have. And then we're just starting to get into some of the certification aspects in terms of how the vehicles themselves are certified, because certification is really the key to the airspace system. So we have to have standardization, we have to have quality control, all of those processes in place as we integrate that onto the vehicle before there's going to be a high level of confidence that they can operate routinely in the airspace.
I can also add a couple of points, I think. One is that right now in U.S. Senate, the Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee, they're arguing what should be done. So this is an ongoing, basically, a discussion, and we're going to hear about it more and more. One other thing that I'd like to basically add is most of regulations, they're based on our understanding of manned aircraft, not unmanned aircraft. So this is a huge hole, and there's a vacuum of understanding how they work, what are the catastrophic failures in them, and so far it is not like manned aircraft that FAA has been collecting data continuously past several decades. So it is relatively young industry, and FAA just started collecting data on UASs, I think like past maybe 5-6 years. And if you want to go back to any historical, I would say, data, you have to use U.S. Army or U.S. Air Force, basically statistics, since there is none. So when there is no base for making good decision, I think defining policies are very difficult. So I think we're in process to come up with a framework, and you will see a framework, but we're not there yet. And unfortunately, people would feel like their privacy may or may not be invaded, and there are some gray areas that they must be, someone should shed light on it.
Yeah, I'd follow up on that, on the regulation and the policy side, we see two sides of it. There's the safety side, which the FAA has to decide how we design these vehicles, how we operate these vehicles to make them safe. But then there is this privacy issue, which is we should all decide how should these systems be used, and if you're flying a system with cameras, how do you handle that data? Who gets to see that data? Should the data be recorded, et cetera, et cetera? And there are all of these questions around unmanned aircraft that really these questions are broader. They're aerial surveillance questions that it could be a manned platform, it could be an unmanned platform. Either way, we should answer these questions. And the only point that I would make is that there are so many applications of unmanned systems outside of surveillance. In the military, it's been intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Those applications don't translate well to the commercial side. The applications that translate well are the mapping, the agriculture, things where we want to fly over fields and take pictures. We don't necessarily want to go do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. And so keeping that in mind with regard to how we sculpt the regulations on the privacy side is important, and keeping that discussion going is definitely important.
Okay. Google, Amazon, and Facebook have all talked about some sort of usage of drones in their services. What are the implications of widespread corporate usage of drones?
Can I?
Good question, I guess.
Yeah.
First of all, they're not the first. In China, apparently, a company established in one of the large cities, and they delivered their cakes using drones. So this is not, and they're very high-end cakes, and people pay the money. So we're not the first, and that was very interesting to know. And then secondly, in South Africa, they had a basically music festival, and they delivered beer to people using drones. And last not the least, a few months ago, or maybe a few weeks ago, I don't know exactly, I don't remember it, but I heard that a microbrewery in, I think, Minnesota, they delivered their beer to people who are doing ice fishing using drone. So
Good application.
there are many different applications that people have already started. So Google and Amazon, yeah, they were basically very big, but people have already thought about it. And I think the beauty of it is that, though people in United States Postal Service, they're amazing. They work so hard to make sure you always get your basically packages. But just think about the implication of whether how you can always make sure that it is going to happen. I think this is why they really like it. There is no emotion involved in it. There is no basically problem calling fatigue or tiredness, anything. You just program it, it does it, and it does it always the same. So there is no variation. There is no, I would say, large variation between today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. I think that's why they like it. This increases the reliability overall, and profit goes, I think, higher. And in other smaller business, I think it is cool. So they say, oh, we deliver it for you using a drone. Everyone say, oh, I want it. It is very cool.
Sounds like many of your uses involve beer, Shawn.
Yeah. That, you know, the cool factor is part of it. This Amazon sort of stunt, I guess, I think was along those lines. I'm not sure how serious they are about that. We'll see. Google and Facebook are both doing interesting things. Facebook, I think, is currently looking at a company that can essentially be almost a satellite replacement for communications, and so that's an interesting application. The one thing that each of these entities brings is a sense of scale that doesn't really happen in the aerospace industry. We're used to dealing in tens or hundreds of units. When they can deal in thousands or tens of thousands of units, it has a drastic impact. You know, this is technically powerful enough to fly a vehicle. It's got enough sensors in it. It's got a camera. It's got communication. It's got everything that an autopilot has. The sensors aren't quite as good as what we use, but practically. And this is cheap. And that has helped drive the sensors down in our markets. And so you see websites like DIY Drones and some of these sort of hobbyist uses of unmanned systems that have cropped up because the prices have come down so much. If these entities put the right development money into the market, then we can not only drive the price down, but drive the safety and the reliability up, which is something that's definitely needed. And so if we could do both of those things with these big entities, then that'll be a big boost.
I think we could see widespread corporate use sometime in the future. I think we'll get there. I think there's a couple of things that have to happen. Number one, policy has to catch up. People have to be comfortable with a large number of these operating above their heads at any given time. And then secondly, we have to establish a legitimate operational track record as we have a rule, as we find out how that's going to be implemented, to be able to do this on larger and larger scales. It's going to be interesting because it's not going to be problem-free. There's going to be issues. There are going to be accidents. There's going to be some of these, unfortunately, are going to fall out of the sky. So we have to figure those things out first. So it's certainly not going to happen in the short term, but I think it could happen.
Yeah, Kurt, you just said that policy is behind the technology. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Right now, when I look out at policy, and when I look at the local level, I see a lot of inconsistency. There are municipalities that have issued hunting licenses for drones, and many municipalities, I don't know, maybe even here in Lawrence, I'm not sure, have talked about banning the UAVs. And so as a society, we've got to reach our comfort zone in terms of where all that happens, and I just don't think we're there yet. And I think we will. I think as younger generations grow and become more confident and more used to technology like this, I think some of those perceptions will change.
One of the principal uses, gentlemen, that you've talked about tonight is surveillance. And that really turns us to one of the ethical questions about drones, which is privacy concerns. How do we, are those legitimate, and how do we address those?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the discussion needs to be had with regard to what are and aren't we comfortable with regard to law enforcement, for example. And one of the things with unmanned systems is that the integration of drones has raised this issue, which is aerial surveillance. Do I know who's flying overhead with some sort of camera? And like I said, it could be a drone, but it could be a manned vehicle as well. And in either case, we should decide how we feel about that. And in our perspective, because these other uses, agriculture, mapping, et cetera, specific security uses, not just blanket surveillance, that's not very effective in the commercial world, but specific security uses, those things are so much more of a focus that it doesn't bother us if this intelligence surveillance, these applications in the commercial world go by the wayside. The other applications are much bigger and much more important to us.
I think there are legitimate concerns. When you look at the news, the headlines, it didn't take much to understand that privacy is a huge concern. And so we try to be, in our operation, very respectful of that. We never fly without the permission of the underlying landowner. We don't take imagery that we're not authorized to take from the vehicle. So it's going to take a transparent process to bring the public along, to win the public's confidence. Because certainly they could be used for ill, for nefarious purposes, but we just have to establish processes that will enable the benefits of this technology without being overly restrictive.
I can also add to what my friend said. Basically, I think one of the differences between manned and unmanned vehicles is that vantage, or the point you can take the information, is very different. So basically, manned aircraft cannot come very close to a building, but an unmanned aerial vehicle can come to a very, very specific point and look into a basically building. And we want this to be used for law enforcement, for military, good things. But if someone who, doesn't have a good, I would say, idea how to use this, or has, other intentions, ill intentions, then there is some concern, and these concerns are really true. But I think, as Bill mentioned before dinner, I think industry and academia, they're waiting for regulations. If you put regulations, people know what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. And like any other thing that we deal in our society, when there is a red line, we expect people to honor it and not cross it. So I think it is a concern, but when you look at the impact of UAS in positive side, it's several orders of magnitude larger than negative side. So I think there might be some instances that people feel their privacy is invaded. Like very recently, I was watching C-SPAN, and I think it was Senator Feinstein from California. Apparently, she was just looking outside her house, and there was some demonstration going on, and suddenly a drone showed up in front of her face, and she just got shot. So this is invasion, and this is not good. But at the same time, again, look at the impact, positive impact UASs have had, and they're going to have, and then I think we can deal with some negative aspect and put some regulations. Last not the least, I was talking to one of my friends. When U.S. intelligence community, they were looking for Abu Musa Zarqawi, the famous notorious terrorist. It took 100,000 hours of surveillance to find him. 100,000 hours of surveillance to find him, and it took a F-16 to take him out in 6 minutes. So that's the beauty of having basically capability to do surveillance in positive side. And in negative side, of course, there were some concerns.
Okay, I have one last question, and I'm going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. But gentlemen, we've talked about privacy. What are some of the other major ethical concerns that people have expressed about the use of drones? I mean, I could see people expressing concerns, in addition to privacy, about criminals getting a hold of them and using them. What are some of the things like that that you've heard that you think are legitimate concerns as we go forward with policy in this area?
That's a great question. Yeah, there are some interesting applications I've heard recently of, similar to the beer delivery, people actually using this in prisons to try and get cigarettes into the prison yard fairly effectively. So there's definitely a concern there, and trying to figure out how we solve the problem of, in a piloted aircraft, in a manned aircraft, there's obviously somebody on board, and so if you see that vehicle doing something it shouldn't be doing, it's easy enough to figure out who that is. With an unmanned aircraft, that's a lot more complicated, and so trying to figure out how we solve that issue of of how we have accountability for these systems is important. To go back to the cell phone example, with cell phones today, you can do a lot of different things with cell phones. It's fairly easy to track who and where and what and why something happened with the cell phone. The same should be true in this new industry. And so trying to figure out how we craft the regulations on, I should say, putting a registration number associated with each vehicle, such that these things can be tracked in some sense, is important.
Most of what I'm familiar with, the concerns have to do with privacy. Other than privacy, there's certainly been some tacit mention of a lot of concern if anybody were to weaponize a UAV used in civilian airspace. I don't see that ever happening. And but in terms of the legitimate concerns, I think it has to do, of course, with safety and privacy.
Okay.
Those are the big areas.
I agree. Safety also is one of the major concerns. Since in many systems you see not very high quality pieces and parts, so failure rate in UASs sometimes they're very higher compared to manned aircraft. And again, it goes back to regulations. What kind of supervisory role FAA is going to play? How you're going to make sure that these systems that they're flying here, they're safe. So when Cessna gets the certification that this aircraft is safe, you're sure it is gone through a very rigorous process and got the basically approval. But there is no such a thing for unmanned aerial vehicle right now. So safety is important.
And I was going to go to audience questions, but you said something I find very interesting. Last week, when we had the representatives from Northrop Grumman here, they spoke at length about how vastly more reliable military UAVs are than manned aircraft. You're saying the opposite is true in the non-military area?
This is, I think, my data is from U.S. Army. If you look at the rate of, they have changed it dramatically, but if you look at the rate of catastrophic event in Predator compared to Cessna C-172, I would say it is several orders of magnitude higher.
Certainly in that platform he was talking about, reliability is high, and they've worked on that. And the implications for it not being are great when they're landing on a carrier. When we're into the the areas that we're in terms of the price range, there is some variation in quality that we have to overcome. And so that's part of the certification process that we're working through. So it's important.
And that's something that, just to say that in the commercial world, there are price ranges everywhere from thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the military world, they're mostly in the hundreds of thousands of dollar category. And so there's this wide spectrum of vehicle cost, and that goes directly to performance and reliability.
Okay, very good. We're going to open it up to your questions now. If you have a question, raise your hand and get the attention of one of our students here with microphones. Please ask one brief question.
Are you concerned that if these really become widespread and you're using them to get your mail delivered and your groceries delivered and the beer at the ball game and everybody's got a remote to get something, that they won't be like garage door openers, and you'll be opening your neighbor's garage door and you'll be sending it through somebody's window? And is there enough bandwidth to have a one-on-one positive control of all these different UAVs flying around?
I would say yeah. I mean, I feel like yes, that's the communication architectures that have come online is one of the things that has driven costs down. In the past, we would operate on serial data links where, we had to do exactly that. We had to know which frequencies everybody else was on so that we didn't hop on each other. Now it's a lot more like Wi-Fi, and this may become an issue. If you ever look at one of those frequency charts, they're very scary, and they're very dense. But I think it's something that there's a lot more work going into that than a garage door opener. But your point is well taken.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
next,
agree.
next question.
Hi. Hi, Bill. How's everything?
Good. How you doing, Chuck?
First, I want to thank the Institute for hosting such an excellent debate on UAS. This is clearly a key issue for our society, not just in Kansas, nationwide, so I want to thank the Institute for hosting this very much. Thank you. My name is Chuck Jarnot. I'm an Army retired lieutenant colonel, 3 tours of Afghanistan. I have 2,000 hours operating UAVs. I run a small company here in Kansas. We have 10,000 hours of experience, built 3 UAS, have 5 patents, and we're currently in Canada working in agriculture UAS because it's very difficult, as you folks articulated, to do that in the U.S. And my question is concerning privacy. And I'm glad that it came up over and over again in the panel discussion on privacy. It is probably, in our opinion, the #1 public policy issue nationwide with drones, certainly in the top 2, right after safety, perhaps. So my question on privacy is, as important as it is, it may be the limiting factor to whether or not all those roles that you guys described, it might be the limiting factor where the public says we're not going to allow having drones coming around because of possible abuses, right? So secrecy, we think in commercial UAVs is very important. So Dr. Barnhart, your Kansas UAS consortium runs a closed house, does not allow open public meetings, and will not appear to comply with the Kansas Open Meetings Act. So how can we have progress in Kansas on the availability of UASs when our own Kansas UAS consortium is being run by yourself, 2 other university professors, and most importantly, a brigadier general from the Army National Guard? Wouldn't that cause the public to suspect that there's something other going on than agriculture UAS?
First of all, that consortium is a group of volunteers from around the state. It wasn't commissioned by anyone. It wasn't. We have no authority. We have no policy-making role. That consortium formed about this time last year to plan a conference. We planned the Unmanned Systems Conference. As far as I know, I'm not in charge of that group, so as far as I know, it hasn't met since that time, and hasn't no plans to meet that I'm aware of. So that group was formed to plan the conference, and it's in terms of who's on it, it's a function of the members, but I'm unaware of anyone who's not representative of a public agency on that group. So that's what I know at this point.
Okay, next question. We have one back here.
Gentlemen, good to see you, especially Bill.
Nice
How
to
are you? Bill, you did something very interesting when you pulled the phone out of your pocket and showed it to people. And I think that's where the drone industry is going. Not hundreds of drones, people working in their workshops, hiding from the FAA, but millions of drones in the hand, literally in the hand of every person, just like you have a cell phone these days. And I think that's where the business model is, not in the hardware, just like in the cell phone industry, but in the apps that will become available. That people are there's going to be a boom of drone-related apps that people will create. Just because the price and the complexity of the drones comes down so quickly, probably over the next 3 to 5 years. I think we are going to see probably a cell phone type business model. And that being the case, what's your thoughts on the whole open source that's happened in the drone industry? You can go on eBay and buy a drone for $300 out of China. And if it's not the Chinese, it's the Israelis and the Eastern Europeans. So, your thoughts on that?
So I think, we talked about these applications that we see, agriculture, security, mapping, but the fact is that nobody knows what the big application is actually going to be. And we see it a lot like the computer industry, that in the beginning, people would buy a computer to program or to write code or do other things. In the beginning, it didn't make sense that you would do desktop publishing or graphics work on a computer. That's not what they were used for, but that became a big application. And we see the same, I think, in the unmanned aircraft industry, and that's something that the open source community, I mentioned this website, DIY Drones, do-it-yourself drones. You can literally go and for hundreds of dollars buy autopilots that work pretty good, and there's open source software to fly them, and it's pretty fun. And with that, I think we'll see a lot more experimentation and different applications. And there could be something totally different that we haven't thought of that becomes the big use of unmanned systems. It could be something as simple as a quadcopter that has a GoPro that will follow you down a mountain as you ski to record what you do. That could be the big thing, and that's something that people can develop on their own with the open source community. So it's pretty exciting, pretty interesting.
Open source is big. We use both military-grade autopilot systems and open source autopilot systems. And the open source technology is coming up to where it's just incredible in terms of its capability. So we now train on some of that equipment. We still train on the higher end stuff, but it's important for the students at our level to be able to understand the capabilities of those systems. And so I've been very impressed with the DIY drones in particular. We use some of their technology.
I would add, as long as the level of accuracy demanded is not very high, as long as the aerodynamics involved with the design is not very complex, as long as the speed is not very high, as long as you don't want to fly it in every weather, I think, yeah, you can say it is more or less like an application. But as long as you add this complexity to it, I think open source is not going to cut it. So maybe in 10 years, but not right now. For applications we discussed, like, yeah, in structured environment, like this place, or in good weather, benign condition, good. Small vehicle, very slow motion, yes. But as soon as you just move from this benign zone to more serious, this is not going to work.
Okay. Other questions? Do you have a question back here?
Yeah, you guys talked about a variety of business-to-business models, agriculture, civilian law enforcement, and things like that. Do you see anything in the consumer market, marketing directly to people, any markets for drones for there?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty big one. It's a lot like the computer model of it. In the past, it was, you know, IBM and DEC and these big companies would build big computers for big corporations, and that's where the money was. But then as they were able to make computers smaller and smaller and cheaper, then you could give a computer to a person and have them do something with it, and they do different things with it, and that generates a whole new market. And the same is true in the unmanned industry, and I'd echo Dr. Keshmiri's comments that today those systems, the DIY drone systems, the hobby, a lot of the hobby grade systems out there are great. They don't have the same level of sensors, maybe not the same level of algorithms that are running them. So that's where we try and bridge the gap between those systems and military systems. But you can do a lot with them, and there's definitely a market there. There are people that want to tinker, and that's good to see. As an engineer, I like to see a lot of people tinkering.
Yeah, I think using them to, you know, for somebody that has property to monitor what's going on their property, I think at some point we'll get there. Certainly farmers, growers that have large amounts of land have already talked about that. Whether or not they use them on their own or as a part of a service they provide probably depends on what specific application they're talking about. But I think there is at some point going to be a market for that.
I think with growth in private sector, you will see more applications. growing and exploding, not just linearly. It will be very, very exponential. And the best example is applications. When Apple started their App Store in 2008, in less than 2-3 years, they had 1.1 million different applications. No one even imagined in 2 years there will be 1.1 million different applications based on just one idea. But since people started basically changing this capability to their needs, it started growing very fast. And I don't know how many apps right now we have in, Apple system or Android. But I think you will see very, very large growth in applications in all directions.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Excuse me. You've talked about, I'm thinking through the applications you're discussing, and you've definitely talked about how the drones are perceiving, they're able to sense things, and they're able to see things, also a form of perception. You've talked about deploying and things like pesticides. I'm wondering, how much are you working with mechanical engineers, or how far are we from getting them to act, doing robotic things such as saving lives for high-rise window washers or construction workers? Are you integrating with robotics?
At the university level, definitely, there's a lot of research, some here at KU and elsewhere, that go to the next level of what these systems can do. In a lot of ways, unmanned aircraft they're perceived as being very, very advanced and complex algorithms, but really they're advanced in the sense that they stabilize themselves well, and they could get from A to B very easily without interference. But they don't take it to the next level in the commercial world, even in the military world. In the research world, some of that stuff is being done, learning algorithms and much more complex tasks. The concept of a medical drone is something that is being worked on. So on the battlefield, you don't need to send a piloted manned vehicle in to help out. You could just send an unmanned vehicle, and if you need to carry somebody back, put them on the unmanned vehicle. These are applications that have a lot of interest, but there's a lot more development that needs to go into them.
I would add, echo what Bill said. I would add 2 factors are missing. One is adaptation, second is intelligent. So if you want to really have real applications, the way you described it, you need to adapt to unknown situation when you don't have any prior information, and also make intelligent decisions. If you add these two, there are very, very basically hot topics right now in universities, then the applications will open up to the level you discussed.
Yeah, far in the future. I mean, I don't know how far, but certainly it's not something that we're looking at anytime soon. But that field of artificial intelligence is just incredibly fascinating, and some of the capabilities that we see just boggle the mind. So, what's down the road, it's really hard to predict. But certainly on an operational level, we're not dealing with anything like that right now.
Okay, I think we're going to take 2 more questions. We have one in the back.
You had mentioned that younger generations are going to come up and this, their whole idea about technology is different. I know that as someone whose children had to teach her how to work her iPhone. Are there resources for kids to learn about your field, like websites or anything to kind of begin exposing them to it so they understand, so they can kind of separate it in their minds from the military uses?
I know in our situation, we do tours probably every week, and we have kids in the lab all the time, and doing presentations out in the community. In terms of resources, for kids, at this point, I'm not aware of any. I know the AUVSI website has a lot of resources, but it's very professionally driven, professionally oriented. So I think it's a great idea, though. I think, you know, at some point we're going to have to start developing those resources so that they can understand the opportunities that exist in that area. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Surprisingly, Lego, I think, is a good Lego Mindstorm. You could do some. Lego is no longer just building blocks. It's full-on robotics and pretty impressive. So that's a good place to start. There are some interesting online resources for actually for programming that simplify programming in a way that breaks it down, and kids actually pick up programming pretty quickly and get into that. Do-it-yourself drones is sort of an interesting website to look at. It's maybe slightly more advanced, but yeah, I'd start with Lego. That's a good starting place.
And YouTube.
And YouTube, yeah.
That's true.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Thank you, gentlemen. Right now, the airspace is covered by the FAA, and we have individual aircraft flying from point to point under various levels of control. And if there's a transgression, the FAA is fairly well able to understand what happened and then deal with that situation. Given the profusion of these unmanned aerial vehicles and drones, what kind, have any of you gentlemen thought about how we would enforce anything that the FAA comes up with, given the fact that you could walk into any number of stores at this point, buy one, and fly one?
That's a good point. I mean, certainly as a part of the next-gen air navigation system, we're going to have ADS-B transponders on board some of these aircraft. Now, where they're going to be required, I don't know yet. Until we have a rule, we just don't know. But certainly that gives the ability to track the UAV. But, you know, the FAA will tell you first and foremost, well, one of the first things they'll say is that we're just not an enforcement agency. And so I think that the prospect will be very, very difficult and probably not really high on their priority list, but could become very important, I think, down the road.
I think this is one of the things that we won't necessarily know how to deal with it until we start. And so hopefully this year the FAA will release the small unmanned aircraft system regulations. Basically, for anything that looks or feels or operates like a remote control aircraft today, you operate within line of sight below 400 feet, et cetera, et cetera. Basically dip our toe in the water with that and work through that and see what issues. Obviously, some people will break the rules as they do today with RC aircraft. But start the process. So we don't have to boil the ocean. We don't have to integrate every single unmanned aircraft system from thousands of pounds at 5,000 feet on down. If we could start with systems that look and feel like remote control aircraft, and we could get somewhere and start to prove out what these systems need to carry. And from our perspective, all we want to know is what we need to do. Do we need to carry a transponder? We will. Do we need to carry nav lights? We will. Do we have to stay within line of sight? We will. All of these things, we're willing to work with the FAA and to work with private pilots to make sure that this is done safely and effectively.
I also add that if you have a GPS system-based separation, that would be also an option, since all the sensors integration, they are mainly based on the GPS or situational awareness of UAV, since there is no pilot on board. So GPS is a must. You cannot fly UAV without GPS. So when you need to know where you're at, you have to communicate with GPS. So if you basically develop a system that you can track all the UAVs using their GPS, that's, I would say, what you will see most probably in the next few years.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a terrific program tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out. Next week is spring break, and all the students will be gone, and we'll still be working here, but no programs next week. But we will be hosting Mrs. Cindy McCain on March 25th. Most people know her as the spouse of Senator John McCain. but she's an extraordinarily accomplished woman in her own respect, and we're going to talk to her about all that she's done during her very impressive career. So join us for that, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.